Some rules are meant to be broken, especially when it comes to love. Will the librarian's quiet world be enough to resist the pull of an unspoken connection? The library was a world of its own, a hushed, timeless sanctuary where nothing but the rustling of pages and the soft thud of footsteps echoed through the air. It was early in the afternoon, the sun slanting through tall windows and casting a golden hue over the room. Dust motes danced lazily in the beams of light, the kind of stillness that only a library could possess. The young man, no more than 24, walked through the heavy oak doors with a sense of quiet purpose. His shoulders were slightly hunched, as if trying to blend into the background. He had come for the books, of course, but there was something more, something unspoken, that kept pulling him to this particular library, on this particular day. As he moved deeper into the space, the familiar scent of old paper and leather-bound books filled his lungs. It was comforting, like a secret shared between the shelves. His eyes scanned the rows of books, but they were more distracted than focused, as if a part of him was waiting for something, someone. That's when he saw her. She was standing at the circulation desk, her back to him as she rearranged a stack of returned books. The librarian. She was older than him, at least by a decade, but it wasn't the age difference that caught his attention. It was the way she moved, the quiet grace in her every action. Her hair, dark and streaked with silver, was neatly pinned back, but a few wisps escaped, softening the sharp angles of her face. She wore a simple blouse and a long skirt, modest yet elegant. Everything about her demeanor seemed to exude an effortless sophistication. There was something magnetic about her, a quiet authority, like she was the keeper of secrets, holding a vast knowledge in the palm of her hand. Her presence felt almost otherworldly, yet oddly grounded in the library's mundane atmosphere. She had the kind of elegance that didn't need to announce itself. He couldn't help but watch her. His gaze lingered on her hands as she carefully stacked the books, fingers brushing against the spine of each one. There was an ease to her movements that fascinated him, and for a moment, he forgot the reason he had come to the library. It was as if time had slowed, the ticking of the old clock overhead becoming a distant hum in the background. She turned slightly, and their eyes met. It was brief, barely a second, but it was enough. Her eyes were a deep brown, warm and intelligent, and in that instant, they seemed to soften. Her lips parted just slightly, as though she were about to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she simply returned to her task, as if nothing had happened. Yet, for him, everything had changed. The young man felt a flutter in his chest, a feeling that was both thrilling and unsettling. His heart began to beat a little faster, the warmth of the library suddenly feeling too close. He quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the books in front of him, but he could still feel her presence. It was as if she had somehow marked him, made an imprint on his quiet, solitary world. He had come here for books, but he left with something else entirely. As he turned to leave, his fingers brushed the edge of the bookshelf. The sensation was a stark contrast to the softness of her touch, yet it felt as if the two were somehow connected, separated only by the slightest breath. The silence returned, the library unchanged, but he was different now. The encounter, so simple, so brief, had stirred something inside him. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself wishing that the rules of silence and distance could somehow be broken. Days passed, but the young man found himself returning to the library every chance he got. He told himself it was for the books, he had an essay to write, a few chapters to read, but it wasn't just that. Every time he entered, he could feel her presence before he even saw her. The librarian. Her energy was subtle but undeniable, like a quiet hum beneath the surface of everything. She was always there, sitting behind the circulation desk or walking among the shelves, her movements purposeful and calm. She had a way of moving through the library that made everything seem more serene. Like she was the heart of the place, and the rest of the world simply flowed around her. Each time their paths crossed, he'd catch a glimpse of her, often from the corner of his eye. He tried to keep his attention on the books, on his studies, but his gaze would inevitably drift back to her. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, but if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. There was a quiet grace to her that kept him at a distance, even as his curiosity grew. The glances were fleeting, just a momentary meeting of eyes, a shared look, before she'd return to her work with that same calm indifference. But every time their gazes met, something shifted inside him. His pulse quickened, and for just a moment, he felt as though the world had narrowed down to the space between them. It wasn't a love at first sight, no, nothing as dramatic as that, but it was a connection, something wordless that passed between them with every shared glance. One afternoon, he found himself in the fiction section, lost in the rows of books, trying to find something to pass the time. He didn't expect her to be there, not in this part of the library. But there she was, just a few steps away, organizing a cart of books to be shelved. She didn't see him at first. He stood there, watching her for a moment longer than he intended. Her hair, dark with streaks of silver, framed her face beautifully, and she hummed softly to herself, lost in her work. Something about the way she was so engrossed in the task made her seem even more distant, yet more alluring at the same time. And then, she turned. Their eyes met, and time seemed to stretch between them. This time, there was no quick glance away. She didn't look down or busy herself with something else. Instead, she held his gaze, just for a second longer than what would be considered polite. He felt his breath catch, the quiet tension hanging in the air between them. The silence in that moment was thick, like the weight of everything unspoken was suspended there, and neither of them knew what to do with it. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, a shy gesture that he hoped conveyed more than his voice ever could. She returned the nod, her lips curling into the smallest of smiles. It was a smile that said everything, and yet nothing at all. It was a smile that made him feel seen, but also reminded him of the distance between them. The boundary that still existed, even in this moment of shared understanding. As he walked away, his heart still raced. The brief connection lingered with him, like a spark that wouldn't fade. And despite the hesitation, despite the weight of unspoken rules that kept them apart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly, quietly beginning to change. Days passed, but the young man found himself returning to the library every chance he got. He told himself it was for the books, he had an essay to write, a few chapters to read, but it wasn't just that. Every time he entered, he could feel her presence before he even saw her. The librarian. Her energy was subtle but undeniable, like a quiet hum beneath the surface of everything. She was always there, sitting behind the circulation desk or walking among the shelves, her movements purposeful and calm. She had a way of moving through the library that made everything seem more serene. Like she was the heart of the place, and the rest of the world simply flowed around her. Each time their paths crossed, he'd catch a glimpse of her, often from the corner of his eye. He tried to keep his attention on the books, on his studies, but his gaze would inevitably drift back to her. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, but if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. There was a quiet grace to her that kept him at a distance, even as his curiosity grew. The glances were fleeting, just a momentary meeting of eyes, a shared look, before she'd return to her work with that same calm indifference. But every time their gazes met, something shifted inside him. His pulse quickened, and for just a moment, he felt as though the world had narrowed down to the space between them. It wasn't a love at first sight, no, nothing as dramatic as that, but it was a connection, something wordless that passed between them with every shared glance. One afternoon, he found himself in the fiction section, lost in the rows of books, trying to find something to pass the time. He didn't expect her to be there, not in this part of the library. But there she was, just a few steps away, organizing a cart of books to be shelved. She didn't see him at first. He stood there, watching her for a moment longer than he intended. Her hair, dark with streaks of silver, framed her face beautifully, and she hummed softly to herself, lost in her work. Something about the way she was so engrossed in the task made her seem even more distant, yet more alluring at the same time. And then, she turned. Their eyes met, and time seemed to stretch between them. This time, there was no quick glance away. She didn't look down or busy herself with something else. Instead, she held his gaze, just for a second longer than what would be considered polite. He felt his breath catch, the quiet tension hanging in the air between them. The silence in that moment was thick, like the weight of everything unspoken was suspended there, and neither of them knew what to do with it. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, a shy gesture that he hoped conveyed more than his voice ever could. She returned the nod, her lips curling into the smallest of smiles. It was a smile that said everything, and yet nothing at all. It was a smile that made him feel seen, but also reminded him of the distance between them. The boundary that still existed, even in this moment of shared understanding. As he walked away, his heart still raced. The brief connection lingered with him, like a spark that wouldn't fade. And despite the hesitation, despite the weight of unspoken rules that kept them apart, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly, quietly beginning to change. The days drifted by, and the young man continued his visits to the library. He began to notice the librarian more and more, not just in passing, but in the small, quiet details that made her who she was. The way she moved among the bookshelves with an almost reverent grace, her fingers gliding over each spine as if each book held a secret she was meant to protect. She wasn't just a librarian, she was part of the library itself, as if she belonged to it in a way that made it impossible to imagine one without the other. Their exchanges remained minimal, polite, nothing more than necessary. He'd ask for a book, she'd provide it. He'd linger by the desk, unsure of whether to make small talk, but always feeling that invisible barrier between them. She never seemed to push for more conversation either. It was as though there was an understanding, a mutual respect for the quiet, the solitude of the library. And yet, the more he observed her, the more he longed for something deeper. One afternoon, he found himself sitting at one of the small tables near the windows, his book open before him but his attention elsewhere. She had been near the circulation desk, her back to him, when she caught him looking at her once again. This time, though, she didn't quickly look away. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment longer, then slowly walked toward him, as if fate had nudged her in his direction. "Need any help?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying a certain warmth. His heart skipped. "I'm okay," he replied, almost too quickly, as if the sound of her voice had caught him off guard. There was a brief silence between them, the kind that hung thick in the air. His eyes searched hers, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he simply smiled, the awkwardness of the moment hanging in the space between them. She smiled back, but it wasn't a forced smile, it was genuine, a soft curl of her lips that made his chest tighten. "You know," she began, her voice steady but gentle, "the library isn't just a place for books. It's a place for silence too. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words could." Her words struck him more deeply than he expected. She wasn't talking about books or the quiet of the library, she was talking about the space between them. The silence they had shared. She wasn't rushing into a conversation or pushing for an immediate connection, but instead, she acknowledged the weight of the unspoken bond between them. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then he felt it, the pull, the desire to share something with her. "I know," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. I think that's why I come here. To listen to the silence." She nodded, the corners of her eyes crinkling slightly, as though she appreciated his words more than he could understand. They shared another brief, meaningful moment of silence, no pressure, no need for anything more. It was a quiet acknowledgement that something unspoken had passed between them, and for the first time, he felt the weight of their shared connection without needing to force words to fill the space. As she turned away, returning to her duties, he remained seated for a moment longer, heart racing, mind spinning. It was as if they had just opened a door into something deeper, something that needed no explanation. Something that was beginning to bloom between them, slow and steady, like the quiet growth of a flower in the dark. The days blurred together, each visit to the library becoming more of a routine, a ritual he couldn't explain but couldn't abandon either. The young man still hadn't fully admitted it to himself, but his visits had started to revolve around the librarian. It wasn't the books he sought anymore, it was the soft, unspoken presence she brought to the space. It was the way her calm demeanor made the library feel like something more than just a place to read. It became a sanctuary, a place where time slowed, and even the air seemed to carry weight. Their interactions remained minimal. He'd ask for a book, sometimes lingering too long, hoping for an excuse to talk to her, but she never pressed him. Her answers were always brief, polite, but somehow warm. Her manner was professional, but her eyes, those deep brown eyes, always seemed to linger for just a second longer than necessary, like she was reading something in him that he didn't know how to express. One afternoon, the weather outside had turned cold, and the library was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of pages or the sound of footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. He was at the back of the library, browsing through the shelves, when he turned to find her standing nearby, just a few feet away. She was rearranging a set of books on a nearby cart, her movements deliberate and graceful, like she was lost in the rhythm of it all. He almost didn't notice the shift in the air at first, how his heart began to beat a little faster or how the space between them suddenly felt charged. But when their eyes met, something shifted. The subtle tension that had been building between them over the last few weeks became palpable. They didn't speak, but the weight of their gaze was enough. His chest tightened, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He didn't feel the need to. She held his gaze, just for a moment, before her lips curled into a soft, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of acknowledgement or recognition, it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp but felt in his bones. The world outside seemed to fade into the background as they stood there in shared silence, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, she turned away, going back to her task. But the silence between them remained, and for the first time, he felt the strange intimacy of it. There was no need to fill the space with words, no rush to break the moment. Everything that needed to be said had already passed between them, in a look, in a smile, in a shared understanding that neither of them had dared to voice. He stood there, frozen, for a long time after she walked away. The words hung in his mind, unsaid but undeniable. She had acknowledged the bond between them. She had felt it too. With a deep breath, he turned back to the books, but they no longer seemed as important. It was the silence they shared that lingered in his chest, filling the empty spaces between his thoughts. A new layer of connection had been added, one built not on words, but on shared moments, quiet and undeniable. And in that silence, something profound had been said. Weeks passed, and with each visit to the library, the young man found himself growing more and more entranced by the librarian. He had learned her routines, how she would arrive in the early morning, always in time to settle into her spot behind the circulation desk before the library opened its doors to the public. How she would always wear simple, yet elegant clothing, blouses of soft cotton in muted colors, skirts that reached just above her ankles. She was always calm, composed, professional, but there was an underlying warmth in the way she moved that he couldn't shake from his mind. He had begun to time his visits to coincide with hers, not consciously, but by some strange pull he couldn't explain. It wasn't intentional, yet somehow every day, he would find himself arriving at the library when she was there, watching her from the corner of his eye. There was an undeniable draw, an attraction that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. One afternoon, he found himself in the biography section, idly scanning the rows of books, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He hadn't planned it, but there she was again, moving quietly through the aisles. This time, however, she wasn't simply restocking books or organizing returns. She was arranging a cart of new arrivals, pushing it toward the back of the library. As she moved, he watched her, how gracefully she navigated the narrow aisles, the way her hands slid gently across the book spines, her fingers lightly brushing the surfaces as though she were handling something precious. Without realizing it, he had followed her. He wasn't consciously aware of it, but before he knew it, he was standing just a few feet away from her, the soft shuffle of his footsteps the only sound between them. The cart of books stood between them now, a fragile barrier, an almost absurd boundary between two people who both seemed unwilling to break it. She didn't seem to notice him at first, focused on the task at hand. But as she bent over to place a book on the bottom shelf, she rose, and for the briefest of moments, their eyes locked. That same undeniable pull, that familiar spark, passed between them. The air shifted, thickening with the tension they had both been avoiding. For the first time, he felt the weight of their proximity, the space between them closing in, and it sent a surge of warmth through him. He didn't know what to do. The moment was brief, but it held the promise of something more, something that neither of them had yet dared to fully acknowledge. She shifted slightly, adjusting the cart, and for a second, her shoulder brushed his. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it felt like everything in that moment. His heart raced, and the warmth of her body lingered where their skin had met. He stood still, unable to move, unsure of whether to speak, to break the fragile quiet that had settled around them. Her breath caught for just an instant before she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Sorry, I didn't mean to crowd you." The simple words, the casual apology, seemed to break the tension. But something had changed between them. The touch, though minimal, had sparked something deeper than either of them had expected. As she walked past him, the space between them filled with everything unspoken. The air was charged, and he couldn't help but wonder if she felt it too, the subtle shift that had changed everything in that fleeting moment of closeness. The brush of her shoulder against his had been a quiet declaration, an acknowledgement that something between them had moved from the realm of mere attraction to something more tangible. The air in the library had turned colder as the seasons shifted, and the young man began to feel the subtle weight of winter pressing in. The library, once a place of escape, had now become a place where he found himself thinking more about her than about the books he had come to read. The librarian had been a constant presence, always just within reach, yet always just out of grasp. Each glance, each fleeting moment of closeness had built a quiet longing inside him. But it wasn't just the attraction that kept him coming back. It was something more, a connection that neither of them had yet dared to address. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the library floor, the young man found himself once again seated at the same table near the windows. His book lay open before him, but his attention was elsewhere. He wasn't reading anymore, he was waiting. He couldn't help it, his eyes kept drifting to her as she moved through the aisles, shelving books, lost in her own world. She was focused, immersed in the rhythm of her work, but there was something different about today. She seemed softer. Maybe it was the way her shoulders sagged slightly as if the weight of the day had worn on her. He noticed a faint line of tiredness beneath her eyes, something that spoke of long hours, of being constantly present for others, yet never asking for anything in return. The moment he looked up, their eyes met again. This time, there was no hesitation. The silent barrier between them, built over the weeks of quiet exchanges and stolen glances, began to crumble. He stood up, unsure of what he was going to say, but compelled by something inside him. I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled at him, the lines of weariness around her eyes softening for a moment. "Not at all," she replied. "Is there anything I can help with?" For a split second, he considered asking for something trivial, something to break the silence, to keep the conversation light and easy. But the moment felt too important for small talk. "Actually, I've been coming here a lot lately," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "and I've noticed how much time you spend in here, helping people. I've always admired it. You seem so, at peace in this place." She paused, her expression softening as she regarded him. There was something in her eyes now, something more open, more vulnerable than he had ever seen before. "It's my job," she said quietly, but there was no defensiveness in her tone. It wasn't an excuse, just a simple fact. She folded her arms across her chest, as if considering how much more to share. "But you're right. There is something about this place, it feels like home, in a way. The young man nodded, taking a step closer, drawn into the conversation by the rawness in her voice. It must get tiring sometimes, he said softly, knowing he was crossing a line, but feeling the need to acknowledge what was hidden beneath her professional mask. Always taking care of everything and everyone else. Doesn't it ever get too much? Her lips pressed together for a moment, and she took a small breath. It does, she admitted, the words coming out more freely than he expected. But it's also, the one place I feel I can truly breathe. Away from the world outside. He watched her for a long moment, feeling something stir deep inside him. Her words, her honesty, made something inside him open up. In that shared space, in that small confession, they had just opened a door that neither of them had been brave enough to unlock before. He wanted to reach out, to touch her arm, to show her that he understood, that she wasn't alone in her quiet burdens. Instead, he simply nodded. I get it. Sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps us grounded. She met his gaze, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. She smiled again, this time a little warmer. Yes, she said, her voice a little softer. Silence speaks louder than we realize. And for a moment, they stood there, the air between them filled with understanding, with shared recognition. The conversation had broken the ice, but it had also revealed something deeper, a bond that was growing slowly, surely, with every passing word, every glance. Something real. Something that neither of them could deny anymore. It was an evening like any other, yet the library felt different tonight, more intimate, more charged. The library was almost empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the soft rustling of pages the only sounds in the room. The young man had arrived just before closing, and for the first time, he found himself alone with her. The librarian was at the desk, her usual composed demeanor unchanged, but there was a vulnerability in the air, something that neither of them could ignore. The quiet space between them felt heavier than it ever had before. He walked over to her desk, not sure if he was breaking a rule or simply following a path he had been walking in silence for weeks. His heart raced as he approached, each step feeling more significant than the last. This was the moment when something had to be said, when they could no longer ignore the subtle pull between them. She looked up as he neared, her eyes softening when they met his. She didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. I don't come here just for the books anymore, he finally admitted, his voice low but steady. The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile but true. Her gaze never wavered, and he could see the hint of something in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a quiet understanding. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she simply stood, stepping toward him slowly, closing the physical space between them. The air between them felt thick now, the distance closing in. She reached out, and for the briefest of moments, her hand brushed against his arm. The touch was soft, tentative, but it was everything. His pulse quickened. She was acknowledging it, this connection, this tension that neither of them had dared to name. Her gaze flickered to his lips, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was no need for words anymore. The confession had already been made, and neither of them needed to speak any further. The silence between them was enough. The library was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock that marked the final moments before closing. It was late, and the usual hum of conversation had faded, leaving just the two of them in the stillness. The young man stood by the door, reluctant to leave, his heart heavy with emotions that had grown too strong to ignore. He could feel her presence beside him, like an invisible pull that kept him tethered to the room, to the moment. She was still behind the desk, collecting her things, but the air between them had shifted. It was thick with anticipation, with a longing neither of them could deny any longer. He knew it was time. There was no more pretending, no more avoiding the truth that had slowly unfurled between them in these quiet, stolen moments. He took a step toward her, the weight of the room pressing down on him. The silence felt both comforting and unbearable, as if the world outside had ceased to exist and all that remained was this single, precious moment. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her eyes. She had been waiting, too. Slowly, she stood up, the space between them shrinking with each passing second. Neither spoke. There was no need. The moment had arrived, and words would only break the fragile spell they had created. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered just inches from hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her face softening, her breath warm against his cheek. Time seemed to stretch as they stood there, just inches apart, both of them holding their breath. And then, without a single word spoken, he closed the distance. Their lips met, tentative at first, then more certain, as if the kiss was the culmination of everything they had shared, everything they had felt but never voiced. It was slow, tender, and filled with everything they had been too afraid to say. As they pulled away, their foreheads resting together, neither of them moved. The world outside no longer seemed important. All that mattered was this shared, silent moment, a kiss that wasn't just the beginning of something new, but the quiet resolution of everything that had led them here.